This is Talk Business and Politics with Roby Brock.
And welcome to the program this week. As always, we appreciate you tuning in. I'm Roby Brock. It has been a chaotic week. It's been a chaotic month. Heck, it's been a chaotic year in Washington, D.C. politics. Here to talk about some of the latest developments of the last week is Shepard. He's the editor for the Politico caucus, and he is the chief polling analyst for Politico. It's good to have him back with us. Steve, thanks for being with us.
Great to be back with you.
Let's begin with the special election results of this past week. We had in Georgia and South Carolina two cataclysmic special elections here to fill some congressional vacancies. The Democrats closed the gap in those two races, but the Republicans still won. So at the end of the day, is it about victories or is it about moral victories?
Well, I don't know that it's certainly not about moral victories, but it is about victories, yes. Republicans won that South Carolina seat by 3 points. They won the Georgia seat by almost 4 points. Very different races. South Carolina mostly under the radar, not a lot of campaign spending. Outside groups and national groups from Washington didn't get involved. In Georgia, it was the opposite. The Democratic candidate, Jon Ossoff, raised a ton of money, at least $25 million. His Republican opponent, Karen Handel, who's now Congresswoman-elect Karen Handel, she didn't raise as much money, but she got a boatload of support from outside groups here from Washington, Republican groups, to drag her across the finish line. Look, these tell us different things. The South Carolina race, this is a district that Mick Mulvaney, who's now the director of the Office of Management and Budget, won very easily. Donald Trump carried very easily. And the fact is that the Democrats in that district were engaged and excited, and the Republicans weren't. And that's why it was so close, even if the Republican won. In Georgia, this is a district that was very close at the presidential level, but that Tom Price, who's now the HHS secretary, won easily. This tells us that there are some voters who are used to voting for Republican members of Congress who actually voted for the Democrat here. It might not be enough in this particular district, which has been Republican for a long time, but if you're in a more marginal district and you're a Republican member in a wealthy, affluent suburb where they're used to voting for Republicans, but Donald Trump turns them off a little bit, you might be a little worried that the race was this close. These national Republican groups, they're going to have a lot of money to spend in 2018, but not the amount of money that they had to spend for this one race. There's 435 House races on the ballot in November 2018, not just one or two, as there were this past Tuesday.
So if I'm reading this right, you're saying basically that Republicans may be a little spooked by these results. Democrats may be a little bit enthused by these results, even though they didn't get the actual member of Congress elected.
Yeah, I think Republicans avoided disaster in losing the Georgia seat or losing the South Carolina seat, and they're breathing a sigh of relief for that. But it doesn't change the overall dynamic, which is that on balance, Donald Trump is more unpopular than he's popular, the president. And on balance, he's also changing the dynamic politically when it comes to which districts are really in play between the two parties. This is a district that's been solidly Republican, but President Trump's appeal to white working class voters who voted Democratic, including, as you can imagine, in Arkansas, for a long time, they've been swinging Republican. At the same time, some of these more reliable Republican suburbs have been swinging Democratic. And so some of these individual members who are used to getting reelected fairly easily might have a fight on their hands that they're not used to.
All right, let's shift to healthcare politics. The GOP in the Senate has rolled out their version of healthcare reform. It has had a lot of pushback from Democrats. We're seeing some initial pushback from Republicans even, and certainly some medical groups not coming on board with this initially. What do voters think of the American Health Care Act?
Now, the polls show that voters don't like it. And a new NBC Wall Street Journal poll out this week, a new Politico Morning Consult poll out this week, polling since the House passed the measure, the initial measure at the beginning of May, have showed that more voters oppose it than support it. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it's dead on arrival in the Senate. I know shortly after it was released on Thursday, you saw four Republican senators, enough to scuttle the measure, come out and say they don't support it in its current form. I think what you'll see is over the next few weeks, probably through the 4th of July and into during the month of July, going into the August recess, you'll see senators go back and try to tweak the measure to earn the support of it's Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Ron Johnson, Mike Lee, four conservative senators. They'll try to make the bill more conservative. it still comes down to the people to watch, the senators to watch, are the more moderate Republicans. Dean Heller in Nevada is facing a tough re-election campaign. In 2018, he's running in a state that Hillary Clinton carried over Donald Trump. He's really the lone vulnerable Republican. He came out with a statement right after the bill was released. He didn't seem very supportive of it. And if the bill gets made more conservative, then he could be at risk of defecting. Susan Collins in Maine, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. Republicans can afford to lose 2. Mike Pence can break a 50-50 tie, but if they lose more than that, that's where the trouble comes in. And I think the more, even though you saw conservatives come out against it initially, the people to watch are still the Republican moderates.
Yeah, and so let's go a little bit broader with that. I want to talk about where independent voters are kind of trending in some of the polling that you're seeing, because that's who's influencing some of those moderate Republicans that you're talking about. And clearly we've seen with hyper-partisanship in Washington, D.C., Republicans are going to line up behind this president for the most part in terms of polling numbers and statistics. Democrats are going to line up against him. Where have independent voters come since maybe Election Day to where they are now? What are you seeing in terms of a shift or not a shift in independent voter attitudes?
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that. You're absolutely right about the partisanship. We're in a situation right now where even if you just look at the president's job approval rating, 90% of Democrats disapprove of the job he's doing. 80 to 85% of Republicans approve of the job he's doing. There's more enthusiasm on the Democratic side than the Republican side, but by and large, people are retreating into their respective partisan camps. The voters in the middle, and when you look at independents, some of them are really closet partisans, and they like the independent label, but they're really aligned with one party or the other. But when you look at the people who are really in the middle, that 10% slice of the public, you saw a lot of voters who were willing to give President Trump a chance. Some of them have lost their patience with him, and his approval ratings are underwater, meaning more disapprove than approve. But you still do get about 20% of that share of the electorate that's undecided on what they think about Donald Trump's presidency so far. And those are the folks to watch as we move. They're willing to give him enough of a chance that we could get to the 2018 midterms with those people still hanging in the balance. But that's when folks, unless you're in one of these states with these special elections where you have to go to the ballot box and make a decision now, you can afford to spend some time and see how things go, see how someone totally from the outside, deals with the entrenched institutions of Washington. And then when we're talking, when we're sitting here in 13 or 14 months and we're looking ahead at the 2018 midterm elections, then you'll start to see a lot of those members, as we get into the closing months of that campaign, they're going to look at where those voters are in their states and their districts, and then they're going to recalibrate accordingly to how they run their campaigns and how they talk to those voters about whether there'll be a check and balance on the administration or whether they'll be more supportive of the administration.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, for voters, it becomes a binary choice. I think we lose that a lot in some of this up to midterm election kind of pondering that we get into. It still comes down to a choice. Am I going to vote for this one candidate or the other? Do I like this one candidate better than the other? And so sometimes some of the things that we detect in the data doesn't always tell us what's going to happen in the outcome.
Yeah, and that's precisely what happened in Georgia this past week. You had a lot of Republican voters who didn't participate in the first round of voting back in April in the initial vote, and then were inundated with television advertising, with phone calls, with knocks on their door, with mailers to their houses to come out and vote in the runoff this past week. And for a lot of these Republicans who maybe were lukewarm about the president and his job performance, ultimately they were faced with a binary choice. And that's why Republican Karen Handel, who trailed in the polls for most of the campaign, ended up pulling it out on Election Day, because they came out and they made a binary choice to stick with their party.
Yeah, one of these days you and I'll have a conversation about these special election polls. They make me nervous. I stay away from them. I don't try to get into the middle of them, and we don't have very many down here in Arkansas. He's Stephen Shepard. He's with Politico. He is their chief polling analyst. He is also the editor for the Politico Caucus. As always, we appreciate your insight. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Rebby.